Hi, it's me, Daniel, and today is day 8 of the BCC Open. Yes, it's almost the end. There's one more round to go tomorrow. And today was a very long game. Again, it was a game that took about um, 3 hours plus, right? So it was a long game. And it went all the way to an end game, rook and pawn end game. It was really tiring. Okay, right, let's have a look at the game. As you can see on the board next to me, I was playing black, and here I met the Rosolimo attack. Yeah, I played the Sicilian, and white played bishop b4. And I actually played a move that wasn't very good, but this is something that I remembered from 30 years ago. So some of my opening theories, yeah, they're a bit old. They're 30 years old, and they've changed a lot today because of computers and how computers they analyze the opening moves, and there are actually quite a lot of openings that were in vogue 30 years ago that have been found to be not so good, and they're not really much in use today, right? But I played it. Okay, so let's have a look. So I played a6 and bishop takes the knight, and I took back with the d pawn. So the idea here is black has got double pawns on the c file, but the d pawn is open, so the queen's bishop is free to go out. Okay, so a lot of times in a lot of openings, black has an issue with the queen's bishop. Okay, so here the idea is I can move the bishop out quickly. Okay, although the position is not very good for black because you've got these 4 pawns that are more stuck towards the queen side, and white has got a lot more play towards the center and the king side. Okay, and white doesn't have any double pawns. Okay, knight c3, I move my bishop out, and my idea was, well, white has traded off a bishop, and I'm going to do the same. Basically, at this point, I'm really exhausted, right? This is the 8th round, and this is my first classical tournament. So I was like, well, you want to trade? Let's trade, right? And then we'll see. Maybe I can just block things up or something, and we could call it quits and have a draw. So white moved h3, possibly expecting my bishop to either move back to d7 or h5, but I just took the knight. He was a bit surprised. Took back to the queen. So from the position here, you can see white is actually better than black, right? So basically my idea is, if possible, trade, and then basically try to play like a solid pawn structure where it's just blocking everything, right? And just go for the draw. I move my knight up. So my idea is, if white pushes e5, I'm going to move my knight to d5, offering a trade again. White prepares to move the bishop. Okay, here I move quite passively. I played e6. A better move would have been e5, fighting for control of the center and blocking the center actually. So black would then have 2 pawns attacking the d4 square, and black's pawn on e5 would also be controlling the f4 square. White's bishop would be able to come to g5 to pin the knight, okay, but then black could move the bishop here to defend. But I wasn't really happy with that position, and I thought, oh, I'll just play a bit more passively. So white was able to move the bishop to f4, and this is a great diagonal for the bishop. Okay, so I developed my bishop, preparing for castling. So I was ready. If white were to move g4, I will move my queen out of the way, maybe to d7, and I could then castle. White castle kingside, I followed suit. And now white prepares for a push in the center, right, by moving the rook to d1. I thought, well, there's not much I can do with the center at the moment. White's got the initiative and the advantage there. And I thought, well, I'll just go play on the queen side, right? See if I could provoke some pawn moves, and then maybe either get an advantage on the queen side or at the least lock the pawns on the queen side. So white move b3. I move my rook to d8. At the moment, white still has got a very good spatial advantage, especially in the center towards the kingside area. Okay, so I'm just trying to provoke some weaknesses and distract white a little bit. And okay, rook e1. And again, I'm just trying to provoke stuff, right? Nothing much. That was a good move. So moving the knight to e2, actually, white has got a choice of going to g3, and then the knight can support an attack or a pawn push on the king side. So maybe, for example, moving g4 before moving knight g3. I thought, well, I'll just try to block the d file. Okay, and here I was a bit surprised. White moved c5, c4, because then white actually has got a backward pawn on d3. And since I'm planning to double my rooks here, right, I will have two rooks aiming at the d3 pawn. And then I realized what white was planning, moving the knight to c1, where the knight is defending these two pawns, right? So they've sort of like locked the pawn structure on the queen side, right? And the rooks are protecting the knight protecting the pawns. So white is very, very solid. Okay. Here black moves h6, just waiting, see what white plays. White moves e5. And then I decided to, okay, I'll move my knight here. The idea for moving here is I could move my bishop here, offering a trade. And another thing is I've got this where I could move my knight to f8 and then back out to g6. And that's a much better square for the knight. So here, white is threatening to take the h6 pawn, and with the pin, the g pawn will not be able to take back. So I moved bishop to g5. Let's trade. Come on, come on, come on. Trade, 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 trade. That will help me a lot because, well, in terms of the position, white still has got an advantage. Okay, so maybe here white is thinking of maybe like moving the queen up and then moving the rook to either f3 or g3, okay, to support a kingside attack. So I traded bishops, and then I moved my rook to d4. So by doing this, white is basically limited to a few options. Rook to e4, and I'm very happy to trade rooks, or queen to f3, g3, or h2. So that would mean either the queen is very passive on h2, or if the queen's on g3 or f3, it'll be blocking the rook. So the rook cannot actually sort of like come out to attack. And then I could maneuver my knight to f8 and to g6. And then I've got quite a good kingside defense. So we traded rooks, and I moved my last rook, and then white offered a trade. Oh, trade queens. What was I going for? You remember, right? A draw. Okay, fine. Let's trade queens. So things are looking up now. This is actually kind of a drawish position. Okay, but white looks like apparently he seemed to be playing for a win, so he still kept pushing and pushing throughout the whole game. Okay, so I maneuvered my knight. Here, I opted for a more passive defense. So having my rook on the second rank, mobility is limited. But what I'm looking for is I've got my rook defending the b7 pawn, which in turn defends the a and c pawn. So I'm opting for a more passive defense at the moment. So the idea here is I could maneuver my knight to f4 and then possibly to d4. Again, looking for a trade with the knight on e2. And yes, I got a trade. Okay, and here I took with the rook because I could still have some sort of pressure on the backward d pawn on a3. And here white centralizes his king, and there's this trick of b4, and black cannot take the pawn because then king would take the rook. So I move my rook again. I move to my rook to d7, defending my b7 pawn. Okay, so white prepares for the pawn push. We trade pawns. Yay! No more isolated pawn. Okay, and here, if white were to move c5, that actually traps the 3 black pawns on the queen side. And then white would have a more active rook, and white would be able to have white would have an advantage again in this rook and pawn endgame, because white's center pawns and kingside pawns would be more free, whereas white has got only 2 pawns locking up 3 black pawns, right? And white would have 5 pawns against 4 pawns on the center kingside area. Fortunately, my opponent didn't play that. My opponent played d4, okay, and I had no choice now, but I had to push b5. And here again, my opponent made a mistake. He played a4. Can you see what my next move is? Yes. Boom, I moved a5. Yeah, some of you were right. Okay, what happens then is one has to move his rook, and then I moved b4. Okay, by doing this, the pawns here are locked. Okay, but the b pawn, right, if given a chance, will be able to move down to queen. So here, black has got an advantage. White moves c5, locking the pawns. Okay, so now the pawns here on the queen side and the center, they're kind of locked. Okay, so that leaves only the kingside pawns to play for. And I move g5. White moved the king up. So I took the pawn, and here white cannot take the pawn, because if white takes the pawn, black's rook would be able to take the d4 pawn. And white must have realized this after I took f4, because he didn't take the f4 pawn. He moved his rook first to defend d4. And here I moved f5, checking the king. Okay, I was expecting the king to take the pawn, okay, on f4, but instead of that, doing that, he actually en passant. So I took back, and instead of taking the f pawn with his king, he moved his rook. So what I did was I moved my king, and here black has this idea of, if white takes f4, black takes the pawn on d4, check, king takes, and then king takes white's rook. And that would mean black is ahead by a pawn, and black's king would be able to take the pawns on the g and h files, and you would then have the b pawn and the h pawns threatening to queen. And if white's king goes for the c pawn, white's b pawn would just march forward to the queening square. So white's in a bit of a conundrum at this point, and I was like, oh, I think I've got the advantage. I think I might be winning. Don't make a blunder. Don't make a blunder. Don't make a blunder. Don't make a blunder. I was like, oh, you've got a lot of time to think. True. But there's also a lot of time to make a blunder and flip the game all round. So I was very nervous at this point. My opponent played h4. I took. Rook takes. I move my king back. Again, still threatening. My rook taking. d4. King takes, and then I'll take white's rook. So white moved his rook back. I wasn't really sure what to do. I thought that moving my rook here and then pushing the pawn is a bit slow, and white could just move his rook, and then his king could march down and take the e pawn. If my king moves down to take the g pawn, white actually has the resource of moving d5. And if c takes d5, the c pawn marches down towards the queening square. So there's still some tactics left for white. So I still have to be very careful here. So I move my pawn up. My idea at this point was, if white were to move the king down to take the e6 pawn, my rook would go to take the d4 pawn. And my rook would still be on the d file, and white's king would not be able to infiltrate to take the pawn on the c6 square. And then white moved his rook to d1. So now he's planning the king march, because his rook is defending the d4 pawn. So I move my rook up to block his king. He moved his rook back, and here I offer to trade rooks. The idea is, if rook takes, pawn takes check, he has to move his king. If he moves his king down to e5, I push my b pawn. And if he moves his king back to d3 to defend, I move my king to f6, and then I can defend against the c pawn. So white move his rook, I move my pawn. And here white was a bit desperate. Okay, so if I take with this pawn, white gets to take the rook. If I take with this pawn, white pushes his pawn. So I took with my rook. We had a rook trade. He moved his king towards the c pawn. I pushed my b pawn, and white resigned. I was like, oh, thank God I didn't like make a blunder. I was just like, I made it. Okay, so with this win, I'm now at 3.5 points out of 8. So I've fulfilled my target of 1/3, which is 3 points out of 9. So I've got 3.5. That's more than 3 out of 9. I'm happy. So in the last game, we'll see. Maybe I'll just have fun, right? Depending on who my opponent is, right? That's it for today's recap. Thank you very much for watching this video, and I'll see you tomorrow. Bye.